With that, I will call to order the Thursday, November 7th meeting of the Reno City Planning Commission. First item on our agenda, I'll ask everybody to rise for the Pledge of Allegiance, and I'll ask Commissioner Hawkins to lead us tonight. Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Michelle, can we have roll call, please?
Kathleen Taylor.
Here.
Peter Gower.
Here.
Ed Hawkins.
Here.
John Marshall is absent. Paul Olivas.
Here.
Alex Felto.
Here.
Mark Johnson.
Here.
We have a quorum.
Thank you very much. Next on our agenda is public comment. This item is for public comment in any action item or for any general public comment. Michelle, do we have any request to speak forms on this item?
No, I do not.
Okay, and I will move on to item 4, approval of the minutes from the Reno City Planning Commission meeting of October 3rd, 2019.
Move to approve.
Second, Commissioner Olivas.
I have a motion and a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed or abstentions? Okay, moving on to item number 5, City Council Liaison Reports.
Mr. Chairman, sorry for the backtrack on the minutes. I do need to abstain from the October 3rd minutes. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you,
A little
Commissioner
slow on the
Gower.
uptake there.
No problem.
Yeah.
I gave you a moment.
I know, you did.
Took a deep breath. Okay.
Thank you.
No problem. Thank you, Commissioner Gower. Okay. City Council Liaison Reports.
No report today.
Okay. Thank you, Arlo. So we'll move on to the public hearings portion of tonight's meeting, starting with case number LDC 20-00016, State Street Plaza. And we will begin with presentation from the applicant.
Good evening. For the record, I am Ken Crater, one of the owners of State Street Plaza, and we are very excited to have a new tenant in tow for State Street Plaza, Back Bay Pizza. This is a very difficult location to lease because of the lack of parking in this area and the special events. And in fact, during hot August nights, the business in our restaurants are typically down 75%. Because Virginia Street's closed. So in order to find a way to draw more customers here, they would like to extend their hours of operation. They're looking to cater to lunch and dinner with a mix of craft cocktails, and very important to have music as another draw for people to come to this area. Staff has limited that, I believe, with the condition of approval till midnight, till we're fine with. But I am confident that this building that we developed back in 2008 is exactly what the city wants to see in this downtown area, mixed-use project with a mix of restaurants downstairs, office upstairs, and we've worked really hard to keep this as a first-class building. And of recent, we've even worked with the urban forester to try and make the two American elm trees out in front much healthier. Fortunately, they're not Chinese elms. We've worked with them to get those trees pruned and sprayed, and also add additional more lighting to just draw more attention to this project. So that's really all I have to say. I hope that you support our endeavor and approve this special use permit, and happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Ken. We'll call you back after we hear from staff. Anne Marie, good evening.
Good evening. Anne Marie Lane for the record. As stated by the applicant, this is a special use permit to extend operating hours beyond 6 a.m. to 11 p.m. Due to the cancellation of both the October and November Ward 3 NAB meetings, the materials were provided to the Ward 3 members via email. Staff received no public comments from either NAB members or members of the public regarding this request. As stated by the applicant, the recommended conditions of approval include a condition that limits music to 12 a.m. midnight and prohibits outdoor live music, as well as condition 5, which limits the operation to 2 a.m. 7 days a week. Staff was able to make all special use findings A through H and recommends approval of the special use permit subject to conditions. And I'm also available for any questions.
Thank you very much. I will open this up for public comment, but first I want to ask commissioners for disclosures. I'll start with Commissioner Olivas.
Commissioner Olivas, I visited the site.
Commissioner Taylor, as did I.
Commissioner Johnson, no disclosures?
Commissioner Velto, I visited the site.
Commissioner Hawkins visited the site.
Commissioner Gower, as did I.
Thank you, Commissioners. Michelle, do we have any requests to speak on this item?
No, we do not.
Anyone in the audience wishing to make public comment on this item? Okay, seeing none, I'll bring it back to Commission for questions. Comments? Or motion?
Mr. Chairman, if there's no questions or discussion, I'm ready to make a motion.
Floor is yours, Commissioner Gower.
Okay. In the case of LDC 20-00016, based upon compliance with the applicable findings, I move to approve the special use permit subject to conditions, and I can make all of the findings.
Commissioner Hawkins, second.
I have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries unanimously. Good luck with your project.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Next on the agenda, item number 6.2, case number LDC 19-00073, Stonegate Phase 1A. We'll begin with a presentation from the applicant's representative. Good evening, Stacy.
Good evening.
Stacy, there's a mouse there too.
The
so-
mouse. A little better for me. Good evening, Stacy Huggins for the record, representing the applicant. This is the first tentative map of the Stonegate planned unit development. A little bit of background for some of you that were not on the Planning Commission when the Stonegate PUD came through. The planned unit development handbook was approved in March of 2018. The handbook at the time, or at this time, when it was adopted, includes 1,700 acres of land, as you can see on the exhibit here on the right. It's a 5,000 lots on the south side of 395 in phases 1 through 5. On the north side of 395 is the town center. There are 435 acres of open space with this PUD and 50 acres of parks. Following approval of the PUD handbook, the Phase 1 special use permit was approved in January of 2019. Again, for those of you that were not on the Planning Commission at the time, that special use permit was for grading with cuts greater than 20 feet and fills greater than 10 feet. It was a special use permit to address disturbance of a major drainage way and also stormwater retention and detention that covered the entire Phase 1 pad. It also established the super pad parcels, which are depicted on this map. You can see I'm pointing to them here, and those are the subject of the tentative map tonight. So the tentative map in front of you tonight, we're calling Phase 1A of that Phase 1 super pad area. It's 671 lots. In addition to the tentative map, we're asking for a special use permit to allow small lot standards, which is allowed by Reno code. And we're also asking for a variance to provide LID basins in lieu of the typical City of Reno landscape parkway strip. So I'm going to start with a brief discussion about the special use permit. Again, that's a special use permit to allow small lot standards. So that would allow lots smaller than 4,000 feet. The PUD currently limits development to lot sizes 4,000 or greater. So there was, when this was done, lots smaller than 4,000 square feet weren't in high demand. We've seen over the years that, the last couple years, that developers are looking to be able to provide this smaller lot. It provides a better opportunity for new buyers to purchase a more affordable, smaller parcel. So this is 92 lots of the 671. You can see the area proposed for the smaller parcels is highlighted here in yellow. Again, the lots are ranging from 2,400 up to 4,600 in size in those two villages. The rest of the tentative map is not being requested to allow those small lots. As you can see here, this is just sort of a graphic of how those lots would work. Again, under the small lot, you have reduced side setbacks. You have a 0 on one side and a 5 on the other, 10-foot front yard setback and a 10-foot rear yard setback. And that's all per Reno code and also, again, conforms to the PUD design standards. The next thing that we're asking for is a variance. I mentioned this earlier. And again, this is a variance to use the LID basin in lieu of your typical parkway strip. So we don't want to eliminate parkway strips, but we want to offer them in a slightly different form. And for those of you that were on the Planning Commission at the time the PUD was reviewed by you, the street sections that I'm going to show you in a minute might look familiar because you all reviewed them and you had approved them. They've been removed at the City Council's request when they approved the handbook and asked that those, if they came back, that they were approved by Public Works as a design exception. Public Works has approved those street sections as design exceptions, and those letters should have been provided in your packets now. The street section conforms with the LID standards that are in the handbook, again, that were adopted as part of that handbook. It also, some of the LID principles that this design and the LID basins, rather than the parkway strips, supports are reduced roadways, sloped streets, the front yard vegetated swale, which again is that basin in lieu of the parkway strip, and then narrow lot frontages and bump outs. So as you can see here in the picture on the right, this is an example of how this might look. So the uphill side or the upslope side of the road would have a 6-foot wide sidewalk and a protected parking area. 6 feet wide is wider than code requires at this point. On the opposite side, or the downslope side of the road, is where the LID basins would be located. These LID basins are 10 feet wide, and so in Reno code, a parkway strip is required to be 5 feet. So these basins are actually wider. They serve a better purpose. The point of these basins really reduces the amount of runoff going into the storm drain system. So it slows the water and the flow going to the ultimate drainage location. They are outside of the city right-of-way, and they'll be maintained by the HOA. This is just another image to show how these LID basins will work within each of the properties. And I want to just make it clear that the LID basins really decrease the amount of impervious surface in the project. And again, they will be maintained by the HOA. And then just so you can see what this will look like when it's a built product. So this picture shows the parking, the protected parking on the uphill side and adjacent to the sidewalk. And then on the other side of the road, what the LID basins will look like. They will still be vegetated. They will still have trees. It will still be a nice parkway appearance, just not your typical landscape strip. So moving on to the tentative map. The tentative map, as I mentioned earlier, 671 lots. These properties within the Stonegate PUD were identified as SF4 and SF6. So we have a mix of lot sizes within this project. These properties on the south end are the SF6 parcels, so they're a little bit bigger. The pieces in the middle are SF4. These are the 4,000 square foot lots. And then up here in the northern part, these are, again, the smaller lots. So it's a nice transition between in this village. With regard to landscaping, all of the front yards will be maintained by the HOA, and this was all designed in accordance with the PUD, so it meets all the PUD standards that were adopted. Trees and shrubs are clustered to create the streetscape. You can see, I know it's a little bit hard, but you can see how they've been clustered in here to make nice green spaces. The project includes a nice landscape trail program around the exterior that connects to the villages with inside. So there'll be several places where residents in this community will be able to access the trail system that's part of Stonegate as a whole. And then there's the common areas include 1 tree and 6 shrubs per 300 square feet, which is also per code and per this handbook. Traffic. So when the PUD was approved, there were several triggers and improvements that were required and agreed to be provided as part of that PUD. The table here that's on this slide shows you what this is right out of the PUD. So you can see that when the project reached 375 PM peak hour trips, improvements were necessary. As we've talked about tonight, 671 units, so we are meeting this trigger one, and these improvements will be done. The intersections within the study area are operating at acceptable level of service with these improvements. And then there were some additional improvements that were required for NDOT related to the first phase of development. These improvements have all been completed, and so those include an ITS fiber optic project, slab replacement and restriping project to add a third lane, traffic cameras and ramp meters on 395, and the realignment of Clear Acre southbound on-ramp between I-80 and McCarran. And if you have any additional questions on the traffic, our traffic engineer, Lauren, is here to answer any questions. With regard to utilities, so sewer is, this project will sewer to the Cold Springs Water Reclamation Facility. There is an intent to serve that was issued in July of 2019. All of the sewer lines will be owned and maintained by Washoe County pursuant to the interlocal agreement that Washoe County and the city of Reno have. With regards to water, TUMWA will provide water service, and they will own all of the water facilities for this project, and an acknowledgement of water service agreement has been issued from them. And drainage, talking a little bit about drainage for this site. So I mentioned earlier the Phase 1 special use permit that was approved in January of 2019 by the City Council. That special use permit covered, again, major drainage ways, retention and detention, but it was for the whole pad. So it covered all of this area without the lots. There was volume mitigation provided in accordance with the adopted PUD for the drainage associated with the entire pad. So that's been approved. The site improvement plans based on that approval have been submitted to the city and are currently under review. So the Phase 1 tentative map lots that we're asking for approval tonight will tie into those previously approved facilities. There's no additional drainage being proposed as a part of the tentative map because it was all approved as part of that special use permit. Because of that special use permit tonight, we feel like condition 10 is unnecessary as part of the approval of this tentative map. Mr. Chair, that concludes my presentation, but I'm available and we have a team of people here that can answer any questions.
Okay. Thank you, Stacy. We'll get a presentation from staff, and I'm sure we'll call you back with questions. Good evening, Heather.
If I could just do a brief introduction before Heather begins this. Arlo Stockham, Community Development Director. There's been some correspondence you've received related to what Stacy mentioned and the stormwater mitigation. You received a letter, I believe, from McDonald Carano Law Firm yesterday, and we felt due to the nature of this and kind of the importance of flooding issues and stormwater issues in the valley that we should provide some additional information as to the basis for condition 10, and you have a memo in front of you that we distributed this afternoon to that effect. To make a long story short, there are a number of different standards in the Cold Springs Basin, and this is Reno's first real development in this area aside from the master infrastructure. Subsequent to the approval of the PUD, which requires volumetric mitigation to not increase flood elevations, there have been a whole series of meetings and evaluations in response to the flooding issues in the North Valleys. Cold Springs flooding is not as acute as in the Swan Lake area, but it's still a very big concern. It got very close to public roadways and homes last winter, and there is threat of continued flooding. There have been studies subsequent to this approval, in particular by Stantec, that recommended that in order to achieve full flood mitigation as it relates to stormwater, we should be requiring retention basins at a 1.25 to 1 basin. essentially to account for siltation and other variations in design that occur by nature of flood events, and essentially they fill in and start sedimenting in. So we provided a bunch of the background. We've been conditioning the 1.25 since that report came out. And the city council, again, subsequent to that, had a workshop on August 5th of this year. A bunch of testimony was provided that some of the retention basins were not functioning to design capacity due to siltation and other issues that just happened. And the council, on the basis of that information, asked staff to start implementing a little additional cushion of 1.3 to 1. We have been doing that for projects since then, and that was our recommendation for this project. Essentially, it's a slightly deeper retention basin, pond in the ground, to account for the siltation and the natural things that happen in this basin to result in full flood mitigation with this project. So we just wanted to provide that additional information. It gets very technical. Mike Michelle is in the room here if you have any questions to that effect. But this is now a standard recommendation, and it's in the draft ordinances coming out for Title 18 to be released tomorrow to codify this. I'm happy to answer any questions on that. Beyond this, we're very pleased with the project. It's a quality project, and Heather has a presentation for you on everything else.
Thank you, Arlo.
Thank you. Heather Manzo, Associate Planner for the record, and thank you for the introduction and explanation on the recommended mitigation. So some of these slides may be repeats and I may flash past them, but I did want to note that the PUD handbook does allow for administrative adjustments of the PUD land uses. That was covered in your staff report, and the maps that are before you this evening were also included in the staff report. And so, as Stacy had pointed out, the area that was requested for small lot development on that northwest portion of Phase 1, there we go. Those two pads there have requested the small lot design based on the SF4 as approved by the administrative adjustment, the map adjustment. In addition to that adjustment, there was a condition of approval that was placed on the master infrastructure SUP that required that the applicant, before moving forward with additional development requests, that they modify the land use within Phase 5 to basically preserve a larger hill feature within that area. And so this adjustment also addressed that condition for the master infrastructure. I think it was condition number 7 of that original SUP that you saw late last year. And so this is the Phase 1 area. And as Stacy highlighted, the yellow areas are the areas in which this tentative map, special use permit and variance request would apply. The other areas within Phase 1 that are not included would include the fire station, which is on that eastern edge, an elementary school site that's been identified, and you have in your packets letters from the school district acknowledging acceptance of that site, and then also a remaining residential future pad site that will come in at a later date for review. And so I just wanted to, especially since we have a couple newer planning commissioners that weren't here for the master infrastructure, just provide you a couple of slides that identify the master infrastructure elements that were included with the Phase 1 SUP that was processed and approved ultimately by council earlier this year. So Phase 1 is highlighted in blue, and the portions that relate to this tentative map are being reviewed tonight. In addition to that, there were some improvements and disturbance of areas that are outside of Phase 1 that include construction haul roads that circulate around Phases 2 through 5, a borrow site or a stockpiling site on the far west side of Phase 5, and also additionally retention detention that Stacy had noted is intended to serve as stormwater collection for Phase 1 and would ultimately be removed when Phase 2 is proposed in the future, and then a construction yard. In addition to that, this will be sewering to the Cold Springs treatment facility, and so to do so, that sewer line does need to be extended northward, and there's a sewer line with a maintenance road that was approved with that special use permit that goes onto the town center site north of the freeway, but also within Stonegate. So those were all aspects that were approved with that master infrastructure special use permit. And another one of the key features of the master infrastructure were the major roadways, which consist of Chase Canyon Parkway, the roundabout, and the collector roadway network coming off of Chase Canyon Parkway. Previously, it was identified as Stonegate Parkway, and also the major drainage way features that are intended to do a couple of things. One of them is to provide for the conveyance of stormwater, and another is to provide for the main pedestrian and bicycle access throughout the development. So as Stacy noted in the tentative map that's proposed, there are multiple connections from each of the pads that are being proposed with the tentative map that will tie into this overall pedestrian and bicycle circulation area. And Stacy's picture was much better quality than mine, but this lays out the proposed lot configuration for Phase 1A. As Stacy noted, pads 1F and 1K, those two to the northwest, are proposed for small lot as allowed by the handbook with the special use permit. Most of the special use permit findings were already addressed with the tentative map findings. However, SUP finding E is most related to the small lot request that's before you. Since this is generally an undeveloped area, Stonegate, is going to set the stage for development. There's really no significant impact that would be experienced by anyone based on that small lot design. This request does not increase the total number of residential lots that are allowed within Phase 1. And so staff is recommending approval of this special use permit for the small lots. In addition to that, the landscape plan you saw already, so I'll go ahead and pass that. We did have the 4 Public Works Design Manual exceptions that were approved by the city engineer in conjunction and coordination with the Community Development Department. Those are highlighted in your staff report, and I do have some visual representations of those as well in case we would need to refer to them tonight. And I also wanted to note, as far as the variance request goes, that the variance request really was a product or a result of the applicant's request to incorporate those LID features within that front yard across the street. Staff really took a look at what the handbook calls out for as far as low impact development design, and the handbook did encourage modifications to street sections, sidewalk design, of which a parkway would be included. And so we did analyze that variance request, really looking closely at what the intent of the handbook was, and the fact that the applicant did follow up after council provided direction with the approval of the planned unit development handbook and received pre-authorization or pre-approval of those design exceptions from Public Works. And so that really concludes my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions at the appropriate time. Staff is recommending approval of the tentative map, the special use permit, and the variance request. I did want to note that I received about 5 to 8 phone calls or emails from folks either looking for information on the request, concerned about master infrastructure, which I had provided some links to the master infrastructure special use permit, as well as the planned unit development handbook. And then there were some concerns relating to just the overall impacts of this development and what it may do to the White Lake Basin. So I hope those concerns are generally addressed through the staff report. And again, I'm happy to answer any questions you may have at the appropriate time. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Heather. Before I open this up for public comment, once again, I will ask the commissioners for disclosures. I'll start with Commissioner Gower.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have visited the site and received emails and corresponded with the applicant's representative.
Commissioner Hawkins, as did I.
Commissioner Velto received emails and met with the applicants.
Commissioner Johnson previously visited the site, received and read emails, and corresponded with the applicant's representative.
Commissioner Taylor, as did I.
Commissioner Olivas, as did I.
Thank you. I will now open it up for public comment. I do have request to speak forms here, and if a reminder, if anybody does wish to make public comment, please see Michelle and fill out one of these forms. I have a request here from Michael D. Martini.
Good evening, Chairperson and Commissioners. My name is Michael D. Martini. I'm a licensed civil engineer for almost 5 decades. I'm familiar with Cold Springs Valley for almost 5 decades. I designed the water systems for about 2,500 homes in Cold Springs Valley, done flood studies, hydrologic studies, soil studies, and other things in Cold Springs Valley. I have looked through all the proposal. I have 3 concerns. Number one, this project involves the importation of a substantial water from Fish Springs and Honey Lake through Lemon Valley out to Cold Springs. That involves a $14 million line. It's a substantial item. That particular line was not yet evaluated in the Western Regional Water Commission's comprehensive water management plan. It's not included. It hasn't been reviewed yet. The impacts haven't been looked at. There are impacts. And under statutes, in particular the Special Act from 2007 by the legislature, facilities such as the one proposed must be included within the plan. It is not at this time. The plan speaks for itself. One just needs to look at it. It's not in there, and this is a major project. It's necessary based upon the applicant's desire to utilize Tumwa Water Service. The only way it can get there is through the line that's not yet approved. Another issue I have is all the ponds, temporary or otherwise, require water rights under the Nevada law. If one goes and looks at AB 138 from 2017, they'll find a lot of discussion by the legislature regarding what water rights are necessary for the types of improvements that are planned as part of this plan. And lastly, I reviewed the soils reports that have been submitted by the applicant for this property. Those soils reports include borings dated August 16th, 2016. That was the end of one of the longer drought spells of history. In their boring, they hit water at 10 feet. The next morning, the water rose to within 2 feet of the surface. This was at the end of the drought, before it even started raining and later flooding in late 2016 and 17. The mitigation proposed appears to be inadequate. I have a model for the valley I've developed over 40 years. That model shows, and I found that the rainfall in 2017 was approximately double what the current mitigation is being requested to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Michelle, do we have any additional requests to speak forms on this item?
No, I do not.
Anyone else wishing to make public comment on this item? You have 3 minutes, and when you're done, go ahead and fill out a form with Michelle.
Thank you. My name is Bill Headley. I'm a resident in Cold Springs, and my property is a little higher than most of the properties around the White Lake, and I have received a letter declaring my property as in a flood zone now due to existing development and future development. They're claiming the county that the lake level will raise average of 1% or more, and I apparently am in a flood zone now when I have never been born and lived in Cold Springs for 60 years. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Just fill out one of those forms over with Michelle so we can get you on the record. Anyone else wishing to make public comment? Seeing none, I will close public comment and bring it back to Commission for questions. Who'd like to get us started? Commissioner Hawkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't know who this should go to. I guess our own staff. Heather, do you know anything about this? All of a sudden, this gentleman's property's in a floodplain. How's that work with FEMA and
Heather Manzo, Associate Planner. I did contact the applicant to request information on any potential letters that had gone out, and I would like to defer to the applicant, or I do see we have a representative from Washoe County, so whichever one is most comfortable answering that question. And I really think it's a letter that's related to the request for their CLOMAR that they had filed. Perfect. Thank you.
Hi, Brian Moon with Loomis & Associates. Part of filing the CLOMAR means that we have to notify all property owners that are affected with the changes to the flood mapping. However, all properties affected are either benefited or no net effect is taking place. And the letter states that and actually provides a table that lists how each property is being affected, whether the base flood elevation is being lowered or if it's being removed from the flood hazard, flood hazard area, or if no net effect is taking place.
if that's the case, why did this gentleman end up with a letter in his lap? I'm curious. I mean, if we're going to
FEMA
do this
required.
development, we can't be displacing or causing anybody any grief here.
There is no properties that are now included in the flood zone. All properties were already in the flood zone that were notified.
Thank you.
Mr. Velto.
My question is for the applicants as well, so whoever wants to field this, I guess. Mine's about condition 10 and the 1.3 to 1 ratio. I understand there are some kind of due processy type issues that are raised. My question is, why is it not in the interest of public safety to have a 1.3 to 1 ratio as opposed to the 1.1 or as opposed to the 1 to 1 ratio?
I'm going to defer to this gentleman right here.
Michael Pawnee for the record on behalf of the applicant. We did speak with the applicant after we received staff's memo, and the applicant can accept that condition if that's the Planning Commission's will tonight.
Commissioners, additional questions? Mr. Gower.
Question for staff, Heather. Heather, for the variance, why are we going through a variance process instead of going back and looking at amending the PUD? And my question specifically is, how can we, in this scenario, make findings A and B for the variance?
Thank you, Heather Manzo, Associate Planner, for the record. Staff did provide an analysis of the variance findings as it relates to the PUD. To answer your first question, an amendment to the PUD is definitely something, it's a tool in the toolbox, and it is something that could be utilized. In addition to that, when we're looking at code requirements, the variance tool is also a tool that can be utilized. In this case, the applicant's design had been included in the PUD handbook, and The city council, when they approved the handbook, noted discomfort with approving the street design model that was being proposed at that time because it included so many design exceptions, and it was really at a high-level review. And so when council approved the PUD handbook, they noted that while they weren't entirely opposed to it, they wanted to have the street sections be designed to City of Reno standards unless the applicant could adequately demonstrate that an alternate design was most appropriate and was supported by Public Works. And so that's where we kind of end up today is the street sections no longer exist in the PUD handbook, but there are LID features that are encouraged within the handbook, and note that those features, incorporating those into design may result in modification to what we would see as a normal residential development proposal for street network design. And as it relates to findings A and findings B, finding A notes that the property needs to be characterized by an extraordinary or exceptional situation or condition. And in this case, we really did look at the unique characteristics of the Stonegate development, the incorporation of those large drainage ways as both a conveyance area as well as their major pedestrian circulation network, and the master infrastructure itself, and how that kind of sets the stage for each of the development pads. And within those pads, we have the residential development that's proposed with you today. And so really a lot of those unique characteristics were embedded into the PUD handbook. That incorporation of LID design where deemed appropriate and acceptable to Public Works are all kind of contemplated within that PUD handbook. And so staff was able to make that finding A as noted in the staff report. Finding B is noting that strict application of the regulation would result in a peculiar exceptional situation. In the case of the street design, I think Stacy's PowerPoint was probably best as far as the quality of that picture that showed the blue drainage features on the downhill side of the street and the sidewalks on the uphill side. So when we look at, thank you, when we look at this design with the uphill feature being the sidewalk, this allows for drainage to free flow from the impervious surfaces down to the LID features on the downhill slope. From staff's evaluation of finding B, including those landscape parkway areas would kind of affect how those LID features function and how that drainage is conveyed to the drainage way. And so those were the reasons why staff was able to support the variance based on those two findings in addition to the other two required ones. I hope that helps.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I have another question. I see John Enlow in the audience, so I'd like to ask him a question related to Tumwa. John, if you wouldn't mind.
Good evening, John Enlow for the record.
John, my question is, where is Tumwa getting the water to serve this development?
Right. The water supply will be provided, talking the water rights or the physical water?
I want to know where the physical water is coming from.
From the Stead Lemon Valley area, we have 3 primary sources of water to that area: Truckee River water, local groundwater, and Fish Springs groundwater. The water that this applicant will use to satisfy his will-serve commitment, he will likely acquire the water rights from the Fish Springs Ranch project.
So without this project, that movement of the water, the need for the water would not be there. Is that a fair statement?
So there's an existing water company within the Cold Springs Basin, Great Basin Utilities, and they serve, I don't even know how many homes, probably a couple thousand homes and so forth, but they do not have adequate water resources to serve this project. So that's the reason that Tama was requested to provide service because the water resources within the Cold Springs Basin, all they have is groundwater, is not sufficient to satisfy the needs of this project.
Okay, thanks, Sean.
You're welcome.
Mr. Chairman, can I ask just a follow-up question to that of our staff engineer?
Mike Michelle, Engineering Manager.
So, Mike, can you just walk me through the sort of the higher level flow of water? So we've got a volume of water coming in to this basin. We've got a certain amount of it being discharged as sewer water. We've got, storm water. What can you just kind of give me your take of the sort of the hydrologic model that's being created, I guess, by this project with this water moving in and out?
Well, I guess I'd start by talking about the various types of water, and we'll start with stormwater. The ultimate place where stormwater ends up is either in the groundwater table or, in this case, White's Lake. We are looking to have the applicant mitigate and then a little sum of his increase in storm runoff. But ultimately, stuff either goes in the ground, goes to White's Lake, or evaporates. That's what happens with stormwater. With potable water, water is imported, and it's used for irrigation. It's used for household uses, and it's either, as far as landscaping goes, it's either evaporated, or in the case of household use, it's discharged to a sewer. And the sewer flows to the county-owned and operated plant. It's treated. I believe it's spread and then percolated into the groundwater. I think that's what they do with it.
So from staff's perspective, then, the introduction of a certain volume of water into a basin that wouldn't otherwise be there, in this case, associated with this phase, this tentative map that's obviously part of a larger development project, that movement of the water to the basin is not of a concern to staff.
Well, I think that's something we're still looking at, honestly. Importing water over a long period of time without there being a means of it leaving in some form or fashion, could be an issue. I'm not an expert in that. It's something that's still on our minds.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioners, additional questions? Commissioner Taylor?
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a follow-up question on the variance, and this is probably for Stacy, based on what I think I heard. And Heather, I'm sure you probably said it, but I'm going to condense it just a little bit to make sure. So with the basins versus the landscape islands or parkway, I think I heard you say that they decrease the impervious surface as opposed to a parkway. Is that correct?
Stacy Huggins for the record. That is correct. And the reason the impervious surface gets decreased in this case is that the street section is narrower. So the basin itself doesn't decrease the impervious surface, but the street section tied in association with the LID basin is narrower, thus reducing the impervious surface.
And that is a positive thing when we're talking about water runoff.
Yes.
So my other question is, if you didn't have the parkway there, if the variance wasn't granted, what would happen?
Well, the first simple answer to your question is we would have to do a redesign. The street sections are still allowed by the design exception. We would end up going back to a narrower sidewalk on both sides of the street potentially, with the parkway strip on one side of the street, which would be smaller, narrower than what we're offering with the 10-foot. I mentioned in my presentation, code requires a 5-foot landscape parkway strip. We're providing a 10-foot vegetated swale in that front yard. And just as a side note to that, while this basin is being located in the front yard of these lots, the building envelope has been pushed back so that each of those lots actually has a normal-sized front yard, so it's not taking away front yard space for these individuals.
Is there a benefit to the city in regards to maintenance with eliminating the parkways?
The parkway strips will be maintained by the HOA. I'm sorry, not
Okay.
the parkway strips. The basins will be maintained by the HOA.
Okay, so is there a maintenance benefit to eliminating?
I would say yes.
Okay, thank you.
Otherwise, the city will maintain them.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Stacy. While you're up there and talking streets, just a couple of quick follow-ups to that.
Okay.
The variance that we're looking at here is only for the streets that are part of these tentative maps. This isn't impacting the main backbone parkways that I saw on Heather's example that appeared to still have the landscape parkway strip in the middle as a larger roadway. Is that?
The request for the variance is only being asked for the villages associated with this tentative map tonight.
Okay.
It will not happen on larger, so it's the local roads
Okay.
within the project.
That was, okay, thank you. That was the clarification I was looking for. And then the second one, I saw some information in here, including, I think, condition number 6 regarding the guest parking, perpendicular versus parallel. I believe the condition is in there, should you choose to continue with the perpendicular parking, but then it seems like there was some additional discussion about doing away with that.
Let's see.
I guess I'm comfortable that the condition is there, but I'm asking maybe, is there a little more direction or understanding with where the applicant plans to go?
I'm trying to find out if I have a map that shows those. I don't think I have an exhibit that shows that very well. So maybe a little bit of background from where this all kind of came to be. We, again, with the narrow streets and parking on one side, if you live in a neighborhood that has limited or no parking on the street, you can appreciate that if you have people over, there's very little room for extra parking when they come to visit. And so the Stonegate developers said, we want to provide parking opportunities within these villages with the narrower streets so that people don't have to walk from, maybe way over here to get back here. And so we had proposed some parking areas that were perpendicular. This section of code that we're talking about right now isn't real clear on how those perpendicular parking spaces should be considered if they're associated with residential development. It says that parking spaces, perpendicular parking spaces, may be provided in conjunction with single-family and multifamily projects. And so we had quite a bit of conversation with staff about whether these parking spaces were appropriate. They have been generally located in places that people can park there and access the trail system around the edge, so we felt like that was extra important. We had conversations with Public Works, and Public Works staff felt that the perpendicular parking spaces and people backing out of those onto these local streets that really don't carry a lot of traffic was not going to create a safety hazard. And so the plan, the most recent plan showed parallel parking spaces, but we appreciate the opportunity through condition 6 to utilize perpendicular spaces as they're appropriate.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
That does answer my question. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Commissioner Hawkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is for Mr. Enslow.
Yes, sir.
How long before we have water to the site? A rough estimate.
The design of the pipeline facilities is essentially complete. I mean, they would have to, I'm not familiar with the construction schedule, but probably a year or so, maybe less.
Now, if they have any wells on site, will they have to be capped?
No, I mean, we would actually like to see a groundwater well or two on the site for municipal supply because it would provide a redundant supply to the pipeline. I mean, our preference would not be to have a single long pipeline serving a large development like this without any other source of supply. So having an on-site well or two would be a good thing. We're also looking into kind of a two-way emergency interconnection with the Great Basin Water Company.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
A question for the applicant. Question. Does that go along with what you're thinking, Stacy, as far as the municipal well?
Yes. I'm looking to the engineering team. Yes.
Okay. And we can't start putting sticks together until we have water at the site, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And all these units, since they're the first ones up, they're all going to get sprinklered, correct?
That is correct per the handbook. Until the permanent fire station is constructed at the 1700th unit, all of the units will be sprinklered.
Thank you. That's all I have.
Thank you, Commissioners. Additional questions?
Mr. Chairman, I have a couple questions relative to the tentative map. Heather? Heather, I'm looking at finding A under the tentative map, which talks about environmental health laws, regulations. We've talked about water. We've talked about water supply. It also mentions air pollution, and I didn't see that analyzed in your staff report. How does staff analyze that as part of that finding for a tentative map?
The staff report did note the multimodal connectivity that is provided throughout the Stonegate development and was included as a part of the master infrastructure for Phase 1. In addition to that, a lot of the air quality features, multimodal access to the town center will come into place as outlined by the handbook. Internal circulation and opportunities for neighborhood commercial facilities to help reduce trips necessitated to access some of those commercial uses by residential development in here were also contemplated with the PUD handbook. And so you're right, I could have included a couple of sentences kind of acknowledging that the broader air quality features really had been addressed primarily at the PUD development stage. In addition to that, we do have a local school site that is going to provide the opportunity for safe routes to schools without having to utilize a bus system and hopefully won't generate too many vehicle trips by parents due to proximity to the residents within the development. So I hope that helps to address your question.
So I understand the sort of the inter-project multimodal connectivity. And I guess my question is, how does the city analyze a tentative map that is 10 miles outside of the urban core when we look at comments received on this project and others from air quality management and talking about how urban form and pattern is one of the biggest determinants of our ozone issues and vehicle miles traveled, and city council, signed on to be a partner to that ozone advance program. I mean, how do we, as a city, balance that commitment with a tentative map proposal and being able to make this finding regarding air pollution?
So I would go back to the PUD. The PUD sets the stage for development within this area. There's already in place an allowance for these home sites to be developed through the PUD process. And so I think that was a conversation that we had during the development of the PUD when it was originally proposed. And the PUD noting the location of the site was ultimately approved.
So as part of the tentative map then, because we have to make findings relative to a tentative map, how is the amount of homes proposed as part of this tentative map going to mitigate potential air pollutants that are generated by the physical development of these homes, not associated with the PUD? I understand that we went through this conversation in the PUD, but we've got proposed homes. How are these homes? Are we talking EV infrastructure? Are we talking trip reduction programs? Are we talking carpooling requirements? How are these homes associated with this tentative map going to meet the air pollution requirements consistent with what we talk about in our master plan, in our zoning ordinance, and everything that we advocate for as a city and as the council we signed up for? Not us as the council, but the council has committed to. Arlo, maybe you have an answer to that. Heather, if you have an answer, I'd love to hear it.
I would like to. I'd like to bring us back to that applicable finding. It reads environmental and health laws and regulations concerning water and air pollution. This is consistent with all applicable laws, and the finding can be met on that basis alone. That being said, this subdivision design is of a higher quality in terms of multimodal connectivity than anything we've seen out in that area. We have an excellent trail system. We have enhanced sidewalks. We have a school within walking distance of a lot of compact residences. When you think about Cold Springs Valley, it isn't what it was 30 years ago. There are thousands of homes out there. It's not a rural area anymore. And most of those homes have been designed in a way that's entirely auto-dependent. They have to drive everywhere. And here we have a project, as Heather mentioned, approved in a vested PUD, that really is going above and beyond the applicable laws and regulations written into our findings. Not having homes here is not an option. It's in a vested PUD. So that being the case, we really feel that through the compact development pattern, the multimodal transportation, they have gone beyond really anyone else in that entire vicinity in terms of air quality mitigation. So I just wanted to add that to Heather's response.
While Commissioner Gower ponders that, I have a question, I believe for Stacy. Since Commissioner Gower opened up all the tentative map findings, I had to scroll to that as well. I understand with the fire agreement, there is a requirement for a residential station after, is it 250 homes?
Stacy Huggins for the record. Yes, you are correct. 250th home will trigger the EMS facility.
And so obviously that's within phase 1A based on the number of homes we have here.
Correct.
And I know obviously the fire station site is not a part of this, but has there been conversation now that these tentative maps are in place with fire department in terms of where that residential level station is going to be located? Since obviously, 600 or 500 some odd homes, I'm not sure what the process is or the phasing that's anticipated.
So looking at this, there isn't a builder in this project yet. And each of these villages will be constructed at some sort of different timing or phasing. So identifying where that temporary station will be located hasn't occurred yet. But when we hit that 250th unit, then that house, which will be part of whatever village gets built that has the 250th unit, will be purchased and converted to meet that requirement. But I don't know where that's going to be located at this time because the development of these various villages isn't defined.
So I understand that. I guess maybe my question's better served with, based on that response, is the fire department okay with that response? Are they willing to take whatever that house is based on when you hit 250 homes?
I'm going to defer to Heather.
Okay.
Thank you, Heather Manzo, Associate Planner. To answer your question, yes, the fire department did review this and did not identify any concerns. The applicant, while we were working through the master infrastructure component of this request, that was when the fire station location had been kind of solidified. And with that, there are a couple of different options. There's the one option that before the 250th home shows up on a final map, that the applicant work with the fire department to identify a temporary facility for medical services as required. In addition to that, it may be that the market is really good and that the permanent fire station be constructed earlier rather than later. Those are all the requirements and the terms and timing for the temporary station are all outlined in the agreement that was entered into between the city and the applicant during the planned unit development stage. So yes, the fire department's comfortable that at the appropriate time that temporary station shall be identified.
Okay. Thank you. Additional questions? Mr. Gower, I kind of jumped in the middle. You said you had a couple of items, so if not, feel
Also,
free to.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to save it for discussion. Thank you.
Understood. Additional questions, or should we move on to discussion? Okay. Discussion, Commissioner Gower. Now we'll move back to discussion. Want to give it a shot?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll just start with the tentative map. I do have concerns with tentative map finding A, particularly relative to the questions that I was asking regarding the air pollution component of it related specifically to the tentative map. I do continue to have concerns, as I did when we saw this a couple years ago, related to finding D, particularly with the timing of fire infrastructure and the ability of the city to staff that infrastructure. We're talking about Phase 1A, so we're not going to see any sort of fire infrastructure in place other than an EMS, temporary EMS facility. So 650 homes with an EMS with a couple staff. I do understand that there is a Washoe County or a Truckee Meadows Fire Protection District station, but that is a little bit outside of our purview until we have that analyzed in our staff report of being able to make that finding using that facility. I do have concerns with tentative map finding E, particularly related to the master plan. And I had this finding, concern with this finding before, and I feel like as a city we tend to talk out of two sides of our mouth. We advocate for certain things, and then we allow certain other things. And my concern is that we can have the best development that captures trips, it has schools, we have all of that. But if it's in Cold Springs, if it's in Winnemucca Ranch, and we're capturing 30% of the trips, but the other 70% are driving down the highway to the city, are we really, being consistent with our master plan? Finding J, particularly related to fire protection. And then for the variance, I do have concerns regarding the mechanism that was used here. I do have a hard time making findings A and B because I don't understand what the exceptional circumstance is, other than we've got a PUD that dictates certain things, and we want to have other things happen out at the property. So I don't understand why we're not amending the PUD. I don't understand what the hardship is other than the approval mechanism that's in place. So I struggle with that component as well. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner Gower. Commissioner Velto.
Commissioner Velto, for the record, I sympathize with a lot of what the previous commissioner has said about a lot of the tentative findings or the tentative map. But I guess I kind of differ on the ability to make those findings. There's this, when you're dealing with developments that are kind of far away from the city, it seems difficult to kind of develop those areas, assuming that there'll already be infrastructure in place. So in my mind, that they've gotten signed off from fire, from the Washoe County School Districts, from the police department, and there's plans in place to get that infrastructure in place before most of the people are moved in and they're making steps to have an EMS station early on. It seems like either A, we're going to decide not to build there, which may be the argument you're making in regards to the master plan, that it's just not consistent, or B, we're going to say that we should stay consistent with the master plan as it relates to outer areas versus closer to the city center, and kind of accept it as a process of getting fire, schools, police, all of that to follow the development in the housing. So I think it's easier for me to make those findings with regard to public service. And specific to air pollution, I just don't really know what they could do that would kind of satisfy your concerns. Is there like a condition that you would be sympathetic for that may remedy air pollution, your air pollution concerns?
Commissioner, that's a good question. So it's my understanding that we're going to have a lot of vehicle miles traveled or trip generation heading out of the site. So how can we reduce those ozone greenhouse gas pollutions? There are mitigations that are available. I don't want to design this project for them and come up with mitigations on the spot. I'm just saying that without those mitigations in place, I have a hard time making that finding.
Commissioner Taylor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will just be real brief. I think then the finding needs to be changed. If what you're talking about, Commissioner Gower, is not being able to make, when I look at the finding, environmental and health laws and regulations concerning water and air pollution, there's not a specific measure that says if you go above this, then the developer is not meeting it. So I'm very sympathetic to what you're saying, but the finding, that's not how it reads. DMV is doing a VMT study right now. We're getting there. I agree with that. But looking at this finding, that's not what it says in my mind. Thank you.
Commissioner Olivas.
Commissioner Olivas, excuse me, everybody's kind of discussing with Peter, I guess, on his comments. I'll follow on and more on the variance, and I struggled with findings A and B too. And I think that if you go back to when we first saw the PUD and the questions that were raised, and the applicant was putting forth some cutting edge stuff for LID design that the city wasn't comfortable with, and the city wasn't willing to accept it because they weren't comfortable with the maintenance. So I guess that's where and variances are always tough, and we struggle with them because they seem to be a little more focused on the physical aspects of the property, and sometimes they're asked for when they probably aren't appropriate. But I think that the city kind of put the applicant in a box, and that's the special situation and the hardship that they were putting forth something new, and it's different, and the city wasn't comfortable with it, so they didn't get that in the PUD as they tried up front. And now they're in this situation that I agree. I'd rather see the PUD amended, and now that the city seems to be more comfortable with the design. So I think that they're in a dilemma, and that's their hardship and the special situation that the city kind of put them in. And I'd like to see things amended or a different process than a variance myself, amend the PUD, and now that the city's more comfortable with it. So that's kind of how I'm able to to overcome and justify findings A and B because more administratively they were put in the situation.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Velto?
I kind of like that analysis in terms of the finding A for the variance. But I also, in my mind, some of the reason for why they need to have condition 10 also seems to justify the LID features, because that there's going to be more runoff, that we're trying to reduce runoff. It makes sense then that we would have these LID features where they could absorb the water when it's kind of running off of the street. So that kind of is the exceptional situation, and that the trend is changing away from the one-to-one requirement kind of persuades me that this is a unique circumstance and is kind of an exceptional situation to allow for the variance for this project, especially because it's in a basin, there's going to be rainwater. That all kind of makes sense to me as to justify it under the finding A.
Thank you, Commissioner. I wanted to weigh in as well on the variance. I agree. Actually, when I turned it to you the first time when you brought it up, that was the question that I was going to ask. That was the appropriateness of the variance, and I agree completely. It's an inappropriate way to deal with this, but it is what we set up for. I don't like making the findings. I think Commissioner Levis pointed out, whenever we deal with the variance, we always feel like we're opening the door just a little bit more for something else. And obviously, this is an unusual case. I don't think we're going to have too many variances for streetscape development coming before us. But I definitely struggle with just the process that's there. And I think regardless of how the commission moves forward tonight with that variance, I think I would recommend very strongly to staff and the applicant, understanding that this was put on them by, an unfamiliarity with the process and requesting more information. And I think city staff has provided that. They've accepted this as a functional way of moving forward. And I believe that prior to seeing any additional tentative maps here, I would recommend very strongly that the PUD be amended so we're not dealing with this as a variance, because I don't think it's the appropriate way to deal with it, despite the fact that we're there right now. I still struggle, even with all the discussions, making findings A and B, again, because I think we're making them under a pretext that is not what we've seen with those before. So just wanted to get that out there. I think as to the air quality issue, in Arlo, I understand where you're going with it and referring specifically to the laws. I think maybe the way I would look at the concerns that we have there is not so much the laws. I think it's going down to the other finding that Commissioner Gower struggled with, which was finding E, which is the one that specifically mentions conformity with the master plan. And I think we have definitely looked at that, the ozone situation as a part of the master plan. So, so as far as the discussion in terms of making the finding, I agree with Commissioner Velto with respect to how that one is done, but I certainly do look at the concerns raised by Commissioner Gower with respect to the master plan. And again, it's a PUD, so a lot of this has already been hashed out, but I think it is still definitely a concern for us to be looking at as this continues to move forward. And as Commissioner Gower said, maybe there's some discussion or thought process from staff or from the applicant in terms of maybe presenting something as a condition or as a part of future phases that more clearly deals with how this is going to be addressed, not just from a localized standpoint, but from a citywide standpoint. Those are my comments. Commissioner Gower.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to just put one more thing on the record in response to the comments for tentative map finding A, that it's not in violation of any sort of laws. I would just like to point out that the addition of additional ozone and pollutants is in direct contradiction to the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, or the NAICS. And that is an outcome of the Clean Air Act, which is one of the foundational environmental laws for our country. It's been around for 40 years. So when I look at that and I see the laws relative to air pollution, I think we have an overarching obligation, and so does the county. And that's why we've received letters consistently. That's why we have an ozone advance plan in place, because we're not consistent with our ozone levels as a county, as a region. And the health district is the one that's been charged with alerting the community that, hey, we're not consistent with our ambient air quality standards. So we need to do something about it. And frankly, introducing vehicle trips at this kind of a magnitude associated with a tentative map is in direct contradiction to that plan and those standards under the Clean Air Act. So I would just like to make sure that that's on the record. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Gower. Any additional comments?
Mr. Chairman, and it's unmitigated as part of this tentative map. It's absolutely unmitigated other than inter-project. Nothing is being mitigated outside. There's no trip reduction program outside of the development. There's no transit, carpooling, alternative vehicle components. To Commissioner Velto's points, those are all things that could have been considered, but they're not. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. I have a quick question for legal, just to make sure. Do you need, and this is for the commissioners as well, do you need 3 separate motions based on the tentative map, special use permit, and variance?
Yes. Yes, I'd like to see 3 independent motions. I think that'd make a better record.
Okay. Thank you. Commissioner Taylor.
Thank you. Commissioner Gower, we have seen trip reduction in developments before in tentative maps. And there isn't one on this one. So is that a condition, you're most familiar with it, that you would want to see in this?
Commissioner Taylor, we can add that as a condition, but frankly, it's not going to change my vote tonight. So I don't know if it seems futile to go down that road.
Commissioners, is there any additional discussion on any of these 3 items before us on this? And if not, I would request a motion starting with the tentative map, followed by the special use permit, and then the variance. Commissioner Velto.
This is my first one, so I'm hoping to get this right. Based on compliance with the applicable findings, I move to approve the tentative map, subject to the conditions in case number LDC 1900073. I believe that we can make all the applicable findings.
Thank you, Commissioner. I have a motion for the tentative map. Looking for a second.
Commissioner Olivas, I'll second.
Motion is second. Any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
No.
Okay, I have Commissioner Gower opposed, Commissioners Olivas, Taylor, Johnson, Velto, and Hawkins in favor. Now looking for a motion on the special use permit for small lot development. Commissioner Velto?
Based upon compliance with the applicable findings, I move to approve the special use permit in case number LDC 1900073. Believe that we can make all of the findings.
Thank you. I have a motion.
Commissioner Taylor, a second.
A motion and a second on the special use permit. Any additional discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries unanimously. I'm looking for a motion on the variance. Keep at it.
Going. Based upon compliance with the applicable findings, I move to approve the variance subject to the variance in case number LDC 1900073.
Thank you, Commissioner. Have a motion? Looking for a second.
Commissioner Olivas, I'll second.
We have a motion and a second on the variance. Any additional discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
Nay.
No.
Nay. So we have 3 votes for and 3 votes against from Commissioner Gower, Commissioner Hawkins, and Commissioner Johnson are opposed. Commissioner Velto, Commissioner Taylor, and Commissioner Olivas voted for, so that does not carry. Okay. Legal, I'm making sure, are we good with all 3 of those? Okay, thank you very much. All right, thank you, everyone. We will move on in our agenda to, do I have to read the appeals and all of that in there as well on this one, I'm guessing? Appeal process, any final action not including recommendations or failure to take action by the Planning Commission may be appealed to the Reno City Council by the applicant, the mayor, or a city council member, or any person who is aggrieved by the action or inaction. An appeal, together with fees, must be filed with the city clerk within 10 calendar days, starting on the day after written notice of the action is filed with the city clerk. And if the 10th calendar day falls on a weekend or holiday when the clerk's office is not open, the appeal may be filed on the next business day. With that, I will move on to item 7, which is Truckee Meadows Regional Planning Liaison Report. Commissioner Gower, you want to field this one?
Mr. Chairman, we have a meeting likely in December, but not until then.
That is correct. And we haven't had one since the previous Reno City meeting.
Correct.
Okay. All right. Staff announcements. Arlo.
Yes, just a couple quick announcements. The City Council did approve the second reading of the Daybreak PUD approval. That's been submitted to the Regional Planning Agency for the conformance review process. We don't have a scheduled date on that. It may be December, but probably January. Yesterday, the City Council approved the Tumwa Equalization Tank in the border between the Cold Springs and Stead Valleys. So that moved forward. They also approved the small zone change in Golden Valley. And that's all I have at this time.
Thank you, Arlo. Item number 9, Commissioner suggestions for future agenda items. Commissioner Taylor?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Maybe this was done before, but is there a possibility to have Washoe County Air Quality Management come in and give us an update and an education on the air quality? I have a lot of respect for Commissioner Gower, and I just feel like I'm in a hard spot in trying to make these findings and what's put before us when it's just very subjective in my mind.
We can make that request.
Any additional suggestions, Commissioners? Okay. Item number 10, public comment, for either public comment on any action item or for any general public comment. Michelle, do we have any requests to speak forms on this?
I do not.
Anyone wishing to make public comment? Okay. We'll close it and bring it back to the commission for item number 11, adjournment.
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor?
Good night.
Good night.